How could one of the most methodical intelligence networks in human history, an organization that had infiltrated governments across 3 continents and deciphered enemy communications with chilling efficiency, fail so catastrophically to anticipate a single American general's boldest move? On September 15, 1950, when Douglas MacArthur launched Operation Chromite at Incheon, he didn't just outmaneuver the North Korean People's Army. He exposed a fundamental blindness in how authoritarian intelligence services assessed democratic military leadership. The story begins not in Korea, but in the smoking ruins of Berlin 5 years earlier, where the remnants of German military intelligence were being absorbed, studied, and in some cases recruited by the very powers they had failed to defeat. The Abwehr and its successor organizations had pioneered signals intelligence, human asset networks, and predictive analysis of enemy command structures. Yet when former German intelligence officers found themselves advising or observing the early Cold War confrontations, they encountered something their training had never prepared them for: the unpredictability of a commander who operated outside the rigid doctrines they understood. MacArthur embodied everything German military intelligence had been trained to discount: theatrical ego, political ambition intertwined with strategy, and a willingness to stake everything on intuition rather than methodical planning. This wasn't simply about one amphibious landing. It was about the collision between 2 fundamentally different philosophies of warfare and the intelligence apparatus designed to predict them. If you're captivated by how history's greatest intelligence failures reveal the limits of authoritarian thinking, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button to help others discover this untold story, share this video with anyone fascinated by military history and the hidden mechanics of command decisions, and leave a comment telling us which aspect of intelligence warfare you find most compelling. Because understanding how brilliant organizations fail teaches us more than studying their successes ever could. The German intelligence tradition that emerged from the First World War and evolved through the interwar period represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt in modern history to reduce warfare to predictable patterns, to transform the chaos of human conflict into mathematical probabilities that could be analyzed, forecasted, and countered with precision. The Abwehr under Wilhelm Canaris had developed a doctrine that emphasized understanding enemy command structures through hierarchical analysis, assuming that military decisions flowed logically from doctrine, training, resource constraints, and political directives, creating a system where intelligence officers could theoretically predict enemy movements by understanding their institutional logic. This approach achieved remarkable successes against opponents whose military cultures resembled Germany's own: the French, with their defensive Maginot Line mentality; the Soviets with their politically constrained officer corps during the early war years; even the British whose class-based command structure followed recognizable patterns. But American military culture, particularly as embodied by commanders like George Patton, Dwight Eisenhower, and especially Douglas MacArthur, operated according to principles that German intelligence methodology struggled to comprehend. MacArthur had assumed command of United Nations forces in Korea on July 8, 1950, inheriting a desperate situation where North Korean forces were driving South Korean and American units into the Pusan perimeter, a shrinking defensive zone that seemed on the verge of collapse. Traditional military analysis suggested MacArthur would consolidate forces, establish supply lines, wait for reinforcements, and launch a methodical counteroffensive once numerical superiority was assured. Exactly the approach German doctrine would have dictated and German intelligence would have anticipated. Instead, MacArthur began planning Operation Chromite almost immediately, an amphibious assault on Incheon that violated virtually every principle of conventional military planning and risk assessment that European military academies had taught for generations. The technical obstacles alone should have rendered Incheon impossible: tides that varied by more than 30 feet, creating a narrow window of just 2 hours when landing craft could operate; mud flats that extended for miles at low tide, turning the harbor into an impassable morass; seawalls that rose 15 feet above the waterfront, requiring soldiers to climb scaling ladders under fire; a channel so narrow and winding that naval vessels would have to approach in single file, unable to maneuver or provide mutual support if attacked. Former German naval intelligence officers, some of whom were consulting for various Cold War intelligence services by 1950, would have assessed Incheon as a textbook example of where not to attempt an amphibious landing, the kind of operation that staff colleges would use to demonstrate fatal tactical planning. MacArthur's own subordinates, including his naval commanders and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, expressed profound skepticism, with Navy and Marine officers calculating casualty rates that could approach 50% if the operation failed. Yet MacArthur persisted with a certainty that baffled analytical minds, telling skeptical officers on August 23, 1950, that the very impossibility of Incheon was precisely why it would succeed, because the enemy would never anticipate an attack there. This represented a kind of strategic thinking that German intelligence doctrine had no framework for processing: a commander who deliberately chose the most difficult option not despite its risks but because of them, who weaponized unpredictability itself as a tactical advantage. The intelligence blindness wasn't simply about one operation. It reflected a deeper philosophical divide between how authoritarian and democratic military cultures approached command authority and strategic innovation. German military intelligence had evolved within a system where strategic planning followed established doctrine, where deviations from approved methods required extensive justification through hierarchical channels, where individual commanders were expected to execute variations on tested approaches rather than revolutionize tactical concepts in the field. This created an intelligence methodology optimized for predicting opponents who thought the same way, who would make decisions based on orthodox military logic, resource calculations, and institutional consensus. MacArthur, by contrast, operated in an American command culture that, despite its own bureaucratic layers, ultimately granted theater commanders extraordinary autonomy to make decisions that would have required approval from multiple governmental levels in European militaries. His authority in the Pacific theater during World War II had been nearly absolute, allowing him to develop and execute the island-hopping strategy that bypassed Japanese strongholds, another approach that defied conventional wisdom about sequentially reducing enemy positions. By the time Korea erupted in June 1950, MacArthur had spent 5 years as Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan, wielding proconsular authority that blurred military and political functions in ways that violated traditional separation of command and governance. German intelligence officers analyzing command structures looked for constraints, political oversight, logistical limitations, doctrinal requirements that would narrow the range of possible enemy actions, but MacArthur operated with so few effective constraints that the range of his potential actions became impossibly wide. When intelligence analysis depends on predicting choices within a defined decision space, a commander who refuses to accept those boundaries becomes fundamentally unpredictable. The cultural dimension extended even deeper into how different military traditions conceived of the relationship between personality and strategy, between individual ego and institutional mission. German military culture, despite its celebration of figures like Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian, ultimately subordinated individual commanders to a larger institutional logic where the general staff system distributed strategic planning across multiple experts, ensuring that no single personality could dominate operational decision-making to the point of recklessness. This system had produced extraordinarily effective military operations, but it also created blind spots when analyzing opponents whose command cultures worked differently. MacArthur's personality, his messianic self-regard, his theatrical communication style, his conviction that he possessed a unique understanding of Asian culture and warfare, would have appeared in German intelligence assessments as liabilities, as emotional weaknesses that would constrain his effectiveness and make his decisions more predictable through psychological profiling. Intelligence officers trained in the German tradition would have noted his age, 70 years old in 1950, an age when most commanders had long since retired, and concluded that he would favor conservative, low-risk strategies that protected his legacy rather than gambling on desperate innovations. They would have documented his public statements about the strategic importance of Asia, his political ambitions, his conflicts with the Truman administration, and concluded these factors would constrain his military options, forcing him toward politically defensible decisions rather than operationally radical ones. Every factor that should have made MacArthur predictable instead obscured his actual intentions, because the intelligence framework interpreted personality as a limiting factor rather than a strategic wild card. We've reached the heart of this story, and if you're discovering perspectives on military intelligence that challenge everything you thought you knew about predicting human conflict, this is the perfect moment to subscribe and become part of our community exploring history's most revealing moments. Smash that like button to signal that YouTube should share this analysis with viewers hungry for depth rather than superficial summaries. Share this video with friends, colleagues, or family members who appreciate how past intelligence failures illuminate present-day challenges in understanding adversaries, and drop a comment sharing which historical intelligence failure you think deserves deeper examination. Your engagement literally shapes which stories we investigate next. The actual execution of Operation Chromite on September 15, 1950, validated MacArthur's gamble in ways that seemed almost impossible given the technical challenges, with Marines scaling the seawalls at Incheon under covering fire from naval bombardment, securing the port within hours, and beginning an advance towards Seoul that would cut North Korean supply lines and trap their forces in the south. Within 2 weeks, the strategic situation in Korea had reversed completely, with North Korean forces in full retreat, the Pusan perimeter abandoned as UN forces broke out to link up with MacArthur's Incheon landing force, and the possibility of complete victory suddenly appearing achievable. For intelligence services worldwide, including those with roots in German methodology, the success represented a catastrophic assessment failure, not because they lacked information, reconnaissance had documented Incheon's defenses, tidal charts were publicly available, MacArthur's force deployments were observable. But because their analytical framework couldn't process a commander who would deliberately choose the most difficult option available. Former German intelligence officers who had transitioned into Cold War roles found themselves explaining to new employers how their systems had been optimized for different assumptions, how predicting Soviet movements or assessing Chinese intentions required different methodologies than forecasting the actions of American commanders who operated outside institutional constraints. The aftermath of Incheon created its own intelligence challenges, because MacArthur's success reinforced his conviction that his intuition trumped conventional analysis, leading directly to decisions later in 1950 that would prove catastrophic when Chinese forces intervened in Korea. On October 15, 1950, exactly 1 month after Incheon's triumph, MacArthur met with President Harry Truman on Wake Island and assured him that Chinese intervention was unlikely, that if China did intervene their forces would be easily defeated, dismissing intelligence assessments suggesting that massive Chinese troop concentrations were assembling north of the Yalu River. This represented the inverse of the Incheon problem, where unpredictability had been MacArthur's strength when enemy intelligence tried to forecast his movements. It became his fatal weakness when he needed to accurately assess enemy capabilities and intentions. Intelligence services worldwide studied the Korean War's intelligence failures from multiple angles: the failure to predict North Korea's initial invasion on June 25, 1950, the failure to predict MacArthur's Incheon Gambit, the failure to predict Chinese intervention in October and November 1950, recognizing that each failure revealed different pathologies in how organizations processed information. The German intelligence tradition's specific blindness regarding MacArthur highlighted how assumptions about rational decision-making, institutional constraints, and personality psychology could create systematic errors when analyzing opponents from fundamentally different military cultures. By November 1950, when Chinese forces launched their devastating offensive that drove UN forces back down the Korean peninsula, intelligence analysts were confronting the humbling reality that neither authoritarian nor democratic intelligence systems had cracked the problem of predicting human decision-making when stakes were existential and commanders were willing to embrace catastrophic risk. The broader implications extended far beyond Korea into how intelligence services across the Cold War divide approached strategic analysis and adversary assessment. Soviet intelligence, which had absorbed some German intelligence personnel and extensively studied German methodologies, faced similar challenges predicting American actions during crises like the Berlin airlift in 1948 and 1949, where American persistence defied Soviet assessments of cost-benefit calculations. The CIA, established only in 1947, struggled with its own prediction failures, famously missing the timing of Soviet nuclear weapon development and later the Cuban Missile Crisis deployments. What the MacArthur case revealed was that intelligence failures weren't simply about missing information or analytical errors in processing data. They reflected deeper assumptions about how human beings make decisions under pressure, assumptions that were culturally contingent rather than universally valid. German military intelligence had evolved in a culture that valued systematic planning, hierarchical decision-making, and adherence to doctrine, creating analytical tools optimized for opponents who shared those values. When confronted with commanders like MacArthur who operated according to different principles, individual authority, theatrical gesture, intuitive leaps, tolerance for catastrophic risk, those analytical tools produced systematic errors. The challenge wasn't that German-trained intelligence officers were incompetent. Many were extraordinarily skilled within their framework. The challenge was that their framework contained unexamined assumptions about rationality, risk assessment, and command culture that didn't translate across the democratic-authoritarian divide. Intelligence organizations worldwide spent the subsequent decades trying to develop methodologies that could account for cultural difference, personality variability, and genuine strategic unpredictability, with mixed success. The human cost of these intelligence failures measured in more than analytical embarrassment. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in Korea because various intelligence services failed to accurately predict enemy movements, capabilities, and intentions at crucial moments. When North Korean forces invaded on June 25, 1950, American and South Korean intelligence had failed to anticipate the attack's timing despite observing North Korean force buildups. When MacArthur landed at Incheon on September 15, 1950, North Korean intelligence failed to anticipate the operation despite its obvious strategic logic. When Chinese forces intervened in October and November 1950, American intelligence failed to recognize the scale and imminence of the threat despite warnings from field commanders. Each failure killed people, prolonged conflict, and created suffering that could have been avoided or mitigated with better intelligence. The MacArthur prediction failure specifically mattered because if North Korean forces had anticipated the Incheon landing and prepared adequate defenses, the operation could have resulted in catastrophic American casualties without achieving its strategic objectives, potentially changing the war's entire trajectory. The fact that North Korean intelligence failed to predict the attack, despite having every reason to consider Incheon as a potential landing site once MacArthur began assembling amphibious resources, demonstrated that the intelligence blindness wasn't unique to German methodology but reflected broader challenges in assessing opponents whose decision-making logic differed from one's own. North Korean intelligence, operating within Soviet-advised frameworks that shared some conceptual DNA with German approaches, made similar assessment errors for similar reasons. They couldn't imagine a commander would attempt something so operationally difficult when easier alternatives existed. As we close this exploration of one of military history's most revealing intelligence failures, consider how the inability to predict MacArthur's Incheon landing exposes tensions that remain unresolved in contemporary intelligence analysis, the challenge of assessing adversaries across cultural divides, the difficulty of accounting for individual personality in strategic forecasting, the dangerous allure of methodologies that promise predictive certainty in fundamentally uncertain environments. If this story has given you new appreciation for why intelligence work is so difficult and why failures are often more instructive than successes, show your support by subscribing to this channel where we dig beneath historical surfaces to examine the human decisions that shaped our world. Hit that like button to help this analysis reach viewers who crave understanding over entertainment. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that intelligence is not omniscient and that the most dangerous adversaries are often those who refuse to conform to our analytical expectations. And leave a comment sharing which aspect of this story surprised you most or which intelligence failure you think deserves similar examination, because your engagement transforms these historical investigations into conversations that matter. The legacy of German intelligence's MacArthur blindness lived on through decades of Cold War analysis, serving as a cautionary tale whenever intelligence officers grew too confident in their predictive models or too certain that they understood how opponents would behave. The methodologies that failed to anticipate Incheon weren't abandoned: systematic analysis, doctrinal understanding, personality assessment, but they were supplemented with humility about their limitations, with recognition that human decision-making contains irreducible elements of unpredictability, that cultural difference matters more than technical sophistication sometimes acknowledges, that the commander willing to embrace catastrophic risk will always confound analysts optimized for predicting rational actors. MacArthur himself became a symbol of this analytical challenge, a figure whose very existence violated the comfortable assumption that military effectiveness and institutional discipline necessarily aligned, that ego and genius were mutually exclusive, that age and caution naturally correlated. He was 7 years old when he rolled the dice at Incheon, an age when conventional wisdom said commanders should be conservative, yet he proposed and executed one of the most audacious amphibious operations in military history, proving that sometimes the most unpredictable actors are those who have nothing left to lose and everything to prove, those who operate outside the normal constraints that make prediction possible, those who weaponize their own unpredictability as a strategic asset that no intelligence service, no matter how sophisticated, can fully neutralize.